Okay, good morning, everybody. The Talmud Torah sponsors of the day, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of Yitzchak Meir's upcoming bar mitzvah, Riva Mitzner, in commemoration of the first yarzheit of her father, Larry Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim Zatzal. A week of learning is by Aaron and Alana Weinberg in honor of their daughters Bas Mitzvah Dina Hinda. And the Daf Yomi sponsors Hillel and Dina Saklov in memory of Hillel's brother Shmaryahu ben Avram Abba Zatzal and Yisrael ben Avram Abba Zatzal. The Plunka family for the yarzheit of Yisachar ben Yaakov Avinu Zatzal and Yitzchak ben Yehuda Zatzal on the 10th of Eliezer Langer, recognition and appreciation of the Shiurim and warmth of Rabbi Silber for the yarzheit of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Moshe Langer, and Rivka Bas Yitzchak Langer and their family and all the Kedoshim from Europe. Okay. We will begin the bottom of Yud Beis and Yud Beis. We read this quickly at the end yesterday. 3 lines up. Amr of Yehuda, Hani Shushi v'Shvatzri Mesachin Behu. So these are types of foods, types of vegetables, which are not normally eaten by people, and therefore they're not Makabal Tumah. So Rav Yehuda said that a person is allowed to eat to use them as hischach. Abaye Omer, b'shushi mesachachin, b'shvatzri lo mesachachin. Abaye said, the first one I agreed to you, but the second one not. My time akeven to sari rechayu shavik lehu v'nafik. That since they smell badly, we're concerned that a person is not going to enjoy his sukkah, and therefore leave his sukkah in the middle of sukkahs. Amr Avchana bar Rava, Hani hizmi v'higi mesachachin behu. These are types of, Rashi says, mini snes, some type of a thorn bush. So Rav Chanan bar Rava said a person could use them as chach. It fits the criteria. It grows from the ground, it's not makabel tumah. Abaye Amar, behizmi mesachachin, the first one I agree, behigi lo mesachachinon. My time came with the nasri tarfayu shavik lo v'nafik. That since the leaves would very often fall down, and the person who's sitting underneath, it's not very enjoyable. So Abaye said, I'm concerned that a person's going to leave. So that means midrabanan, you're not allowed to use smelly things for schach, and you're not allowed to use the type of schach which would very often fall down on a person's head and make it not enjoyable to be in the sukkah. Amr of Gidol Amr Rev. Hayafkusa de dichlo mesachim behu. Okay, so we talked about yesterday in the Mishnah that there's a din d'Rabbanan, which is if you have a bundle of wood or a bundle of sticks, so then you're not allowed to use it for schach, which we discussed. The reason is that if a person would be coming home and it's wet and he throws it up on top of something just to dry, and then later decides to use it for his schach, so that's a problem d'oraisa. Since he didn't put it up for shade, it's a problem. So Chazal made a gzeira. They made a decree that you can never use that type of roof for a sukkah out of the concern that a person's going to get confused and use it even in the case where he put it up not for shade. So now we're going to have a Gemara trying to define basically which types of bundles were included in that prohibition. So Amr of Gidol Amr Rav Hay Afkusa Dedikla Masachinam Behu. If you have outgrowths of a tree which are all attached together at one point, but they grow out at another point. So in other words, imagine it's like you had a whole bunch of single pieces of wood which are tied at one end. Just the difference here is the tied at one end is because they grew out of the same place. So they're naturally tied at one end. So Rav Gidol Merav says, Hayafkusa dedikla mesachina behu. That's fine to use that as schach. Afal gav da gidi eged bidei shamayim lo shmei eged. That it doesn't have a definition of being tied together if the way it grew naturally, it was connected. That's not included in Chazal's definition of being eged. So therefore, a person is allowed to cut that down and put it up and use that as a schach. That was not included in our gzeir. Afal gav the hadar agid lehu, and even if a person would then take a string and tie it around this naturally connected bundle of wood, that's still fine. Iged b'chad lo shmei eged. because tying together something which is already together is not called tying it together. So in other words, you almost have a loophole that it worked out that you can use this type of bundle, because since it grew naturally, that's not called bound together. Thank you. And tying it together an additional time didn't really do anything because it was already connected, and therefore a person could use that for his schach. So this is really the same halacha, just from a different type of tree. Even though they grew together, that's okay. That's not called that it's bound together. Even though you tied it again with a string, something which is already tied together, tying it again doesn't define it as being tied together. In halacha, it's brought that if a person would add one more stick and then tie it together, then that would already be called a bundle, and that would be included in the gzeira of Chazal. But as long as it's the natural outgrowth of the tree, and a person decided to tie it again, that would be fine to use that for a schach. Person has reeds or dukranim. So Rashi here says mashma trei mili. We're originally assuming it's two different things. V'dukranim k'mo yachbor bedeker. I don't know the exact translation of what that is. Huh? Cane stalks. Okay, thank you. So the Gemara originally thought it was two separate things. The Gemara asked kanim pshita. What is the brisa teaching me? You can use kanim. Kanim means a type of wood that grows from the ground that's not makabel tumah. So that's obvious. A person could use that for schach. So no, the way to read the brisa is ema kanim shel dukranim miszachinam behen. Which means if you read it together as one case, kanim shel dukranim, so Rashi explains that's really what we were referring to before. That we have a support to the halacha we said before, that if you have outgrowths from a tree, which all are connected at one point and then separate, that's kanim shel dukranim, even though they look like they're bound together, a person could use that as schach because that was not included in the gzeira that Chazal made. The Amr of Chisnam Ravina Bar Shila. Hani meraraisa de agma, adam yotze behen yidei chavasa bepesach. Okay, so now we're jumping to Pesach. The reason we're jumping to Pesach is sometimes in the Gemara, if a person spoke it before and he had another statement, so often the Gemara will, once it quoted the one person, will continue to quote different statements that he said. So we quoted before Rav Chizdam Ravina Bar Shila, so we're quoting another statement that he said. So he said a type of maror, which was called maraisa de agma, that it grew in the agam. A person could use that on Pesach. In other words, it had a different name. It wasn't just called maror. It was called maror, which grew in the agam, in that lake, the swamp. Meisvei challenges the Gemara. Azov, we have different halachas in the Torah which it requires using in Azov. And the Brisa says, Azov v'lo Azov yav. Person could use something which is called an Azov, but not something which is called an Azov yavan, a Greek Azov. V'lo Azov kuchli, v'lo Azov midbari, v'lo Azov romi, v'lo Azov sheish l'shem levoy. So the Brisa is saying when the Torah says Azov, you need to find something which is called Azov. If you find something which is called by like a nickname, the Azov of that town, so then that doesn't fit the criteria. So the Gemara's challenging is, the Torah says you have to eat maror on Pesach. So Rav Chizda, Amar Ravina Bar Shila said, and if the maror has a nickname, that's okay. Challenges the Gemara. We have a brisa saying when the Torah says you need to use an Azov, if the Azov has a nickname, it's not okay. Okay, so there's a question like, how do we deal with when the Torah says a term? So it doesn't need to be specifically that item, or let's say that item has a nickname. If there's a different way people refer to that item, they call it the maror of that town, the Azov of that town. So he came and said it's okay. The Gemara is challenging from the Brisa. It would seem that it's not okay because the Brisa said an Azov, which is referred to as Azov of that town, that city, or that country would be a problem. So that's the question. Amr Abaye answers, Kol shenishtana shmo kodem matan Torah, ubasa Torah v'hekapida aleha biyadua sheyesh lo shem levoy. Says Abaye, if before the Torah was given, there was already different names for this item. So he's saying by Azov, there was already different names in the world, that in Yavan, they called it Azov Yavan. In Rome, they called it Azov Rome. And then when the Torah comes, it says, you need to use an Azov. So if there was already, let's say, 5 different names of the word Azov in the world, and the Torah comes and says, use Azov without referencing a specific type, so then it's coming to say something which is called Azov to the exclusion of Azov Yavan, Azov Romi. In other words, if by the time the Torah was written, there was already different ways to refer to it, and the Torah said it in a way without the nicknames, then it's coming to exclude the nicknames. But v'hani lo neshtana shmaya kodem matan Torah klal. Rabbi is saying the reason by marur it's different is because by this marur, at the time the Torah was given, was just referred to as marur, and therefore when Hashem said you should eat marur, it included anything which was called marur. And if at a later point in time we start calling it a different name, right, we would start calling our marur Ploni. We would give it a nickname. So Abaye is saying the reason that's fine is because when the Torah was given, it said eat marur. This was defined as marur at the time the Torah was given. The fact that today I come and make up a new name for it is not going to disqualify it from being included in the Torah's definition of what marur is. So by Azov, he's saying, since before the Torah was given, there was different definitions. So then when the Torah comes and says use Azov, it's coming to say that one as opposed to the others. But if the Torah says eat marur, and I come up today and make up a new name, a new nickname for my marur, so that's not going to be a problem, right? There's a brand name of the marur in the store. So everybody, imagine there was a famous marur out there that everybody was just running in line to get. Okay, so everybody, Tokov? Okay, you know more than me. Okay, so let's say Tokov marur. Okay, so everybody's running in line. Okay, so the fact that we all refer to it when we're talking to each other as a specific type of marur is not going to change anything. Because it's marur of the Torah. At a later point in time, it got a brand name that we refer to it differently. Okay, so that's Abaye's answer. Rav Amar Hani Maraisa Stama Shmayu. V'hai de Karilu Maraisa de Agma Shum de Shtakach Ba'agma. Rav is saying a different answer. He's saying, really, even this type of marur is called marur. When people call it Maraisa de Agma, it's because that's where you could find it. In other words, they're not giving it a new name. They're saying this is the marur which can be found at that location. And therefore, that's not really defined as a nickname. Okay. Amar Rav Chizda, Igid bechad lo shmei eged. Rav Chizda said, if a person bound something, if he took one material and tied it, that's not called bound. Shalosh, if he took 3 materials and bound it together, shmei eged, that's for sure called an eged. Shnayim machlokas Rav Yossi v'Rabbanan. If it's 2, if you took 2 different materials and tied it together, Rav Chizda is telling us that's a machlokas Rav Yossi Rabbanan, and we're going to try to figure out where he saw that's a machlokas Rav Yossi Rabbanan. So let's just read. It says Rashi. Take a look at Rashi, parallel to the Gemara we just read. Lo shmei eged. Rashi says lo le'inyan chavila l'sachech, that if it's 1 and you tie it, it's not called an eged regarding chavila l'sachech, right? That word is schach, not for using it. It's not a problem to use it as your schach. V'lo le'inyan agudas ezav, and it's not a problem for agudas ezav. So what Rashi is saying is that this Gemara is yes talking about schach, right? So our Mishnah talked about using a bundle for schach. Rashi is saying this Gemara we're having is also talking about schach, which means that if you have 3, the Gemara said it's for sure a problem. That means according to Rashi, this Gemara just told us, how big of a bundle is it? That's a problem. If you have 3 sticks tied together, then you cannot put it up on your sukkah. Okay, so I was waiting for somebody to ask me. Schachmetz. Okay? Rabbi Silber did not ask me to come in and tell everybody that you cannot use your schachmetz. Okay, so schachmets are going to be fine. What we will see, I don't know if I'll be giving this year then, but it's very clear from the Gemaras later. There's something called machzelas. Okay, so machzelas is basically a schachmet. Right? It's something they would use, some type of sticks tied together, which they would use to lie down on. So it's to me, it's very clear in the Gemara and in the Halacha that machzelas is totally fine. So the difference is that that's not called a chavila. In other words, that's not called a bundle of sticks. A schachmat is a bunch of little sticks tied together to make a straight line. In other words, you're not stacking them all on top of each other to carry it as a bundle. So it seems to me that that's why that's not included in this decree that we're making. But this Gemara is saying, according to Rashi, that if you have 3 sticks tied together in a bundle, that would be a problem. In Shulchan Aruch, we paskin not like this Rashi. Right? One could have learned this Gemara that the Gemara is not talking about Sukkah anymore. The Gemara is talking about when you have a halacha of agudas ezov, which is what the brisa of what we're going to bring is going to be about. So you can have a discussion. If it's 1 and you tie it, it's okay. If it's 3 and you tie it, it's not okay. 2 is a machlokas. Schach, we didn't talk about schach. And it would come out, this Gemara never defined for me when it's a problem. So in Shulchan Aruch, it's brought that as long as it's less than 25 sticks together, then it's really okay. So I mean, you could have 24 sticks together tied and throw it on top of your sukkah. That's not what our Mishnah was saying. Mishnah was saying 25 or more. Okay, but according to Rashi, it's saying if you have 3, it's a problem. If you have 1 and you tied it, it's okay. If you have 2, that's a machlokes Rav Yossi Rabbanan. The Tanan mitzvahs ezov shlosha klachin ubehen shlosha giv'olin. The mitzvah is to have 3 stalks, which each has a giv'olin, which Rashi says is the middle part of the branch, which the seed is on the top. Okay, so that's the first opinion. Rav Yossi Amar mitzvahs ezov shlosha giv'olin. Rav Yossi says you should have 3. V'shir of shnayim, which means if one of the 3 fell out, that's okay. The gardom of kol shehu, and when after a person sprinkles many times, so then Rashi says it's very often that they would totally break. So if it breaks in that process, as long as there's a little bit left, it's okay. Okay, so we're going to be trying to pay attention to is where do we see a disagreement between the Rabbanan and Rav Yossi if there's 2? Right? Rav Chizda told us if there's 1 and he tied it, it's fine. If there's 3 and he tied it, everyone agrees it's a problem. Rav Chizda told us that the machlokas is if there's 2. So we're going to try to figure out where did he see that. So the Gemara says, "Ksal kadaitin midashayriv shnayim, tchilasanami shnayim." We thought to say that if Rabbi Yossi holds that if there's 2 left over, which means 1 fell out, so then that means even at the beginning a person could make it just with 2 pieces of the wood tied together. When Rabbi Yossi said you should have 3, that was better. But halachically, it's okay if you started with 2 pieces of the wood tied together. So if that's what Rabbi Yossi said, it'd be the Rabbi Yossi shlosha mitzvah, the Rabbanan shlosha la'akiv. So if Rabbi Yossi held that having the 3 is just preferable, better, but it doesn't change the status of being kosher as the agudas ezov, so then the Rabbanan must be disagreeing with something, must have been holding that you need 3. So maybe that's where Rav Chizda saw it. That in Rabbi Yossi who said 2, if it ended up with 2 is okay, we're assuming holds, even at the beginning when you make the bundle, you can do it with 2 sticks. And the Rabbanan are disagreeing with something, they must hold you need 3 sticks. So maybe that's where Rav Chizda saw the disagreement. Gemara says, no, Vatani Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ezov shetchilasa shnayim, v'shai Rav Echad apostle. Rav Yossi says explicitly that if at the beginning in making your agudas ezov, you only made it with 2 things together, it's a problem. Eino kasher ache tchilasa shlosha v'shir of shnayim. It's only good if at the beginning when you made it, it had 3, and then if one of the 3 fall out, it's okay. But you can't say in Rav Yossi that even at the beginning when you made this bundle, you can make it with 2 sticks, because it's explicit that Rav Yossi holds you need 3. So Ipach Rav Yossi shlosha la'akiv, the Rabbanan shlosha l'mitzvah. So Rav Chizda must have understood the opposite. That in Rav Yossi, it's clear in the brisa that you need 3 at the beginning. So the Rabbanan are disagreeing, they must have held that that 2 is what you need, 3 is better. In other words, we flip the names. So Rav Chizda said, if you have 1 stick and you tied it together, everyone agrees that's not called an eged. If you have 3 and you tied it together, everyone agrees it's called an eged. If you have 2, Rabbi Yossi held that's a problem, and the Rabbanan were lenient and held that's okay. Vatanya, so normally Vatanya is a question. Here Rashi says b'nichusa. Sometimes the Gemara will bring up Brisa and use the word v'hatanya, and it'll be a support. So that's Rashi saying ub'nichusa, which means the Gemara is not trying to ask a question. Ezav shetchilasa shnayim v'shayrev echad kosher. That if you had an Ezav, which originally was with 2, and one of them fell out, it's kosher. Ve'eno pasal shetchilasa v'shayrev echad. It's only a problem if at the beginning it was 1, or right now the Gemara is reading it as, or it ended up with 1. Ask the Gemara, Shayrev echad pasal amrat Shayrev echad kosher. The first line said, if you started with 2 and ended up with 1, it's okay. The next line we read it as saying, if you started with 1 or ended up with 1, it's a problem. So ask the Gemara, you just contradicted yourself. First you said if you ended up with 1, it's okay. Then you said it's a problem. Now the way to read the second line is, it's a problem if at the beginning you ended up with what you left off with. Meaning the Bryce is saying that if you started off with 2 and left off with 1, it's okay. But if you started off with what I just left off with, which means you started off with 1, so then it's going to be a problem. So this is a Brisa, which is the Rabbanan's opinion, which we said before. Rabbi Yossi holds by an Agudas Ezav, you need 3. The Rabbanan, who we're seeing in this Brisa, are saying that even though you only started with 2, that's kosher. Okay, top of Amud Beis. Darish Meremer, Hani Asuraisa de Surah Mesachin Behu. Afagav de Ogdan, Leminyana Ba'almahu de Ogdan. Okay, so we're going back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah said a person cannot use a bundle of wood or reeds for Succah. Okay, so Meremer said that if you have an item which is sold together, tied together, but it's sold like that just for convenience for people to take it home, and the norm is you take it home and you separate it. There's no point for it to be together. So then that's okay. Why did they put it together? They put it together to count it, to schlep it home, to make it easier. But that's not included in the decree in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a specific case. The person who comes from his field with his bundle of wood is going to throw it up on his sukkah. So he's saying if you have an item which a person, they sell it in the store tied together for a different reason, then that's not included in the decree of the Mishnah. A person could use that for Succah even while it's bound together. Amar Rav Abba, Hani Tzrifi de Orvani, Kevan Shehutra Rashi Madanim Shalahen Ksherim. So Tzrifa de Orvani, Rashi says, was a type of hut that people who were bird hunting would camp out in, and it was basically some type of, almost like the shape of a Hershey kiss, okay. So how was it held together? It was individual pieces of wood, which was tied at the top and had a tie at the bottom. Okay, so that's, the Gemara is talking about it because is that included in our Mishnah? In other words, you basically have a bunch of pieces of wood tied together at 2 ends in a little bit different of a shape. So Rav Abba Barhani Tzrifa Dervini Kevin Shehutru Rashi Madanim Shalahen Ksheru. He said once you took off the top connection, even though it's still connected around the bottom, it's okay. Ask the Gemara Vagidi Mitatori. What do you mean? It's still connected on one end. Amirav Papa de Shari Luhu. Yeah, he meant if you take out the top and the bottom, then it's okay. Rav Huda Rav Yeshua Afilu Temadul Shari Luhu Kol Eget Sheno Asi Latalta Lalosh Me Eget. That any type of combination of the wood, which is not made in a way that you can carry the wood together, is not defined as an eget, and therefore it's fine. So once you took out the top, and you have a circle around the bottom, which is much bigger than the top's little point. So if you would try to pick it up from there, it's not going to carry very nicely. So he's saying that's not defined as being an eged, and therefore was not included in the halacha of the Mishnah. Amr Rab Abba Amr Shmuel Yeraka Shamr Chachamim Adam Yotim Ben Yidei Chavasa BePesach. Vegetables which a person could use for Pesach mevian es hatumah. They can transfer tumah, which means they can serve as an ohel if it's resting over a mace to allow the tumah to transfer. But they cannot serve as a block between the dead person and separating room. Uposlin besukkah mishum avir. And a person can't use it on sukkahs like avir. So we'll learn a little bit later that there's a different halacha when it comes to schach pasel. Schach a person can't use. And when it comes to avir, which is not having something in the space. Okay, so it's more lenient if a person has schach pasel than if a person has nothing, which is interesting. Okay, so in other words, if a person has metal, which a person cannot use for schach, so then the shear to be a problem is 4 tvachim. If a person has nothing there, then the shear to be a problem is 3 tvachim, which means it's easier to have a problem than if you have bad materials there. So now his halacha is coming to say that if you have vegetables which are going to dry out, so then postlin basukah mishum aver. The halacha is you have to deal with them as air. Okay, so Rashi says as long as they're moist and normal vegetables, so you're totally fine. In other words, they really are schach pasel. But once they start drying out, so then they're going to start drying out and start crumbling. And therefore, his concern was that's going to happen during Sukkot. And you're going to be left without a proper amount of schach and not realize. So therefore, he was stringent to say, you have to deal with it as avir. In other words, if they're in your roof, you have to deal with it as if they're not there, which is a stringency. Don't count it at all. So therefore, a person won't come to a problem on Sukkot. My time, what's the reason? Once they dry out, they're going to start crumbling and falling. Command less nehudami. Therefore, it's as if they're not there. Rashi is clear. He's learning the Gemara is saying a din d'Rabbanan, which means as long as they are moist, it's 100% fine. The fact that there's a prediction that this is going to happen doesn't change anything today. But the problem is when that happens, I could have a problem. Therefore, we were stringent. Midrabbanan to say you always have to deal with it as avir, so a person doesn't run into a problem. Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Huna. Okay, so just a brief introduction before the next Gemara. There's a concept called yados, which means that if you have something attached to the food item, which could be makabel tumah, which its purpose is to help the food item in some way, so then that thing gets the status of a yad, which a yad means that it, just like the food is able to be makabel tumah, so the stick or the branch that it's attached to, which its purpose is to help with the food, gets the same status as the food. Okay, so you have a food which can be makabel tumah. If it's cut off the tree with a branch which helps out with the food, so that's called a yad for the food. A hand for the food. It helps the food. Okay, so just like the food can be makabel tumah, so the yad of the tumah can also be makabel tumah. Because that's the introduction. Now we're going to have two cases where there's going to be a disagreement if there is the status of a yad. The Amar Reb Abba, Amar Rav Huna, habotzer lagas ein lo yados. That a person who cut down a grapevine in order to make wine out of it, ein lo yados. The branches that came with the grapes don't have the status of a yad. Does a person want that branch with him when he's making his wine? All right, any good winemaker knows that you don't want the branches mixed in with your wine. It's not going to make the wine taste good. So even though when he chopped it down, it came with grapes and branch, the branches in this situation are not helpful at all. And therefore, Rabbi Amar Rav Huna is saying, habotzer lagas, a person who chopped down grapes with wood in this scenario, ein lo yados. The wood, you can deal with it as if it's not there, and therefore the only thing that can be makabel tumah, can get tumah, is the food itself. Which means if tumah came in contact with the branch, you would be fine, because the branch is not defined as something that can be makabel tumah. Rabbi Menashe bar Gada Omer Rav Huna, hagotzer l'tzchach ein lo yodos. He said a different halacha. He said a person who chops down for schach, so ein lo yodos. If you have some type of food at the beginning of the branch and you cut the branch with it, he also said that the branch doesn't have the status of a yad, and the only thing that could be makabel tumah, can become tamei, is the food itself. Okay, so we have two different statements. One was talking about a person chopping down a grapevine to produce wine, and one was talking about a person who was chopping down something to use it as schach for his sukkah. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to figure out which one is disagreeing with the other. In other words, they talked about two different things. Says the Gemara, man to amar kotzer, if you said the second case, which means you're chopping down for your schach, that there's no halacha of yad on those branches, kol shekain botzer, then it's even more obvious when you're chopping down to produce wine that there's no status of yad. Why not? Because you don't want the branches in your wine. So if you even said, when you chop down for schach, that there's no status of yad on that type of branch, so then it's a kol shekain, all the more so if you chop down for the wine, where having the branch there is bad for me, that the thing would not have the status of a yad. But the other way, man da amra botzer shein lo yadus, but if a person, the first person who said that if you chop down the grapevine to produce wine, that wood does not have the status of a yad, because having the branch in my wine is bad. Aval kotzer yesh lo yadus. But he would hold that if you chop down to produce schach, then the wood would yes have the status of a yad. Why? Ultimately, it's good to have the food attached to the branch when you put it on your sukkah. As much as the food doesn't count as schach, but it's going to give some weight to the branch so that it won't fly off your sukkah so easily. So in other words, the disagreement is if you chop down a piece of a grapevine to produce wine, so everyone agrees the branches are not helpful. And in fact, it's going to hurt your wine. And therefore, for me, it would have been better if there weren't branches here. Therefore, we don't deal with the branch like the grape, and therefore it cannot be makabel tumah. The disagreement is, if you chop down a branch to put it on your sukkah, so how do you deal with that branch? One says that the food doesn't help me for my sukkah. I can't use the food as schach. It's able to be makabel tumah. And therefore, I don't like the fact that there's a connection between the branch and the food. And therefore, there's no status of yad. The other one says, as much as you can't use the food for your schach, but ultimately having the food there is going to keep your schach, the branch, in place. And therefore, you do like the fact that there's a connection between these two items. And therefore, the branch is going to, yes, be a yad for the food, which is tumah. Okay, so the disagreement is that case. The person who cut down for schach, does the branch have the status of a yad for the food to be makabel tumah or not? Name of the Riva Mitzner bar Gada Tanohi. Gemara says, so let's see if Riva Mitzner bar Gada, which was the second opinion, who said you cut down for schach, there's no yad. Let's see if this is a machlokas tanoim, Tanya. Suchi ta'einem ubehen ta'einem. A person cut down branches of a fig tree with figs on them. Parchilim ubehen anavim. Parts of a grapevine which had grapes. Kashan ubehen shibolim. Chabdos ben tamarim. Date branches with dates on them. Kulan impsolis merubala ochlin. Ksherim. So if a person wants to use it for schach, if there's more things which are no good, in other words, which are the branches, more so than the fruits, then it's okay. It's okay to use that as your schach, because most of the stuff is kosher for schach. Imlav psula. First opinion says, but if there's more fruits than there is branch, then it would be a problem, because most of the thing you're using for your sukkah is not kosher for schach. Acherim omrim, achu kashin merubin ala yodos ve'al ha'ochlin. The second opinion said then no. You need to have enough branches, enough of the wood materials, more than the food and the yados, the branches which are helping the food. So we seem to have a disagreement. Do we count just and the food as the things you can't use for schach? So my love, says the Gemara, this is not their disagreement. The Mar Savar Yesh Lan Yados, Mar Savar Ein Lan Yados. That the one opinion who only dealt with the food as a thing that's no good for schach, he held like the opinion that said if you chop down for schach, there's no halach of yados, and therefore the only thing which can be makabel tum is the food. But the other opinion who said that you have to deal with the branches and the food as things which are pasal l'schach, no good for schach, he must have held like the other opinion that said that there is a status of yad in this case, because since the person wants the fruit on the end of the branch to weigh down his schach, therefore it would yes have the status of a yad. Says the Gemara, L'Reb Abba Vadai Tanohi, L'Reb Menashya Bargada Mi Lema Tanohi. So according to Reb Abba, who said that if a person chops down for schach, there is the status of yad, he's going to have to agree that this brisa, one opinion's like him, one opinion's not like him. But the other opinion, does he have to say one opinion's like him, one opinion's not like him? So the Gemara explains, Amar l'cha Reb Menashe, no. T'kuli alma savria kotel l'sachech, ein lo yodos. He'll tell you, everyone agrees to me, if you cut down for schach, then there's no status of yad. Right? That was his halacha before, because he held that if you're cutting down for schach, then the fact that he's arguing that I don't want the branch attached to my fruit. Since I can't use my fruit for my sukkah, so I don't care about the branch being attached to the fruit. Therefore, the branch does not have the status of a yad. So he'll tell you, everyone agrees to me. So we just learned in a brisa that there seemed to be a disagreement about that point. So he'll say, Hacha b'mayaskinon, the case they were talking about was kegon shekotzatan lachila, that a person initially cut down to eat it. If he cut down to eat it, so at that point in time, everyone agrees that he was happy with the fact that there was a branch there. V'nimloch aleyin l'sikoch, and then he switched his mind, Sukkah's time, and said, you know what, I'll use this as my schach. So he's arguing, if you cut it down for schach, everyone agrees to me that says the person doesn't want the branch attached to the fruit, therefore you don't deal with the branch as a yad. The only thing that can be makabel tum is the fruit. He's saying the case of the brisa was he chopped it down for food. At that point in time, everyone agrees it could yes be makabel tumah, because everyone agrees at that point the branch is good for the fruit. Now the person switched and said, I'm going to use it for schach, and we seem to have he's saying that's the case they're disagreeing about. Is there still a status of yad or not? Okay, but everyone's agreeing at that point when I cut it down for food, the branch which is supporting, which helps with the movement or the production of the fruit, was able to be makabel tumah. He's saying, but the machlokes is when he switched in his mind for schach, did that take away the branch's status of being able to be makabel tumah? So ask the Gemara, if the case is like you said, that he chopped it down for food, my time what would be the reason for the opinion that says the thing which was able to be makabel tumah, the branch, once he switched to use it for schach, now is not makabel tumah? Maybe you'll tell me that the Rabbanan hold that since he switched his mind, the thing which was able to be makabel tumah is no longer. But that's not true. Can a person change the status of the item just with his thought? That's not. The Mishnah says, Kol hakelim yarden lideitum asan b'machshava. That a kli, in being defined as a kli, as a utensil, to be able to be makabel tumah, Kol hakelim yarden lideitum b'machshava. That a person can decide in his mind what he's using it for, and if he decides he's using it for something which its production is finished, so it has the status of a kli, and if tumah touches it today, it could become tummy. But ve'ein olin mitumasa ela b'shinoi maisa. But something which is able to be makabel tuma, a person cannot just switch in his mind to take away that status. What a person needs to do is a shinoi maisa. That means he needs to affect it physically. Okay, so the Mishnah is telling us to get the status of being able to be makabel tuma, a person can decide in his head that I'm going to use this skin as a tablecloth, and if the skin is finished as a tablecloth, so now it's a tablecloth, it could be makabel tuma. But if something's already able to be makabel tuma, so then to take away its status and make it something which is no longer a kli again, that he needs to physically affect it. B'shinoi maisa. Shamaisa motzi miyad maisa. That if a person does a physical action to change the item, it can take away a physical action he did to make it into a kli. Umiyad machshava, and take away the thought that he had to make it into a kli. But machshava, but a thought, that if a person made something a kli with his thought by saying, I'm using this for something which it's finished for, or he physically cut it up and turned it into the type of utensil he wants to use, once the item can be makabel tuma, so then switching in his mind is not able to take it away. Okay, so we're left with a cliffhanger, which is if the case is that the person cut it down to eat and then switched for schach, so then we have to figure out what is the reason for the Tana, the Rabbanon, that it should be okay. If everyone agrees at the time he cut it down to eat, the branch had the status of a yad, which allowed it to be makabel tuma, so how come Sukkah's time when the person switched his mind, now it's going to take away the status that branch had for being able to be makabel tuma?